Hello everyone, welcome to the Development Economics course, the first week lecture. As you can see in the slide, today's topic is going to cover some of the fundamental concepts that anybody interested in development economics should start out with. So in today's class, we will talk about the broad theme of development, what we mean by it, and then make it a little bit concrete by talking about the concept which lies at the heart of development economics, which is the phenomenon of poverty. So we will explore various conceptual details surrounding the notion of poverty, and then we will talk about a very important aspect of poverty, which is its measurement. Because any policy that a government or a think tank or an NGO wants to think about in terms of reducing poverty must first have an understanding of how to capture this phenomenon of poverty using data, so that we can get a sense of its spatial variation. Where is poverty concentrated, for example, geographically or in terms of population groups, and also its a trend over time, whether poverty is going down and by how much, etc. So in order to answer these questions, we must have a good sense of the measurement issues involved in measuring poverty. So let's jump straight away. So what we mean by development? Historically speaking, development or the process of development meant the overall improvement in the material well-being of society. Right? So starting with the Adam Smith's notion of wealth of nation, we have come to equate the economic prosperity of a society with its stage of or state or stage of development. So countries or societies that have very high level of economic prosperity, say measured in today's terms by the gross domestic product, we tend to refer to them as developed countries, and those with very low gross domestic product, say per capita, are referred to as less developed, right? So that was sort of is our conventional notion of development, which begs the question that as a policymaker or as a government, then what should be the goal? Should the goal then be just maximizing economic growth, ensuring economic prosperity of the society, and would that necessarily translate into the transition from being underdeveloped to being developed, right? So basically, we want to understand, is economic growth same as having development? Now, this equation of growth with development has been questioned since the very inception of the idea of development, or the idea of incidence of poverty and its desirability to reduce poverty. And this has been sort of put in the forefront, so to speak, by research by Amartya Sen, who has emphasized through various of his research articles and books that we should not equate economic growth with development, and economic growth, even though while it is an important aspect or input into the development process, it is definitely not what we should primarily look at, or definitely not the only thing that we should look at if we were to understand whether the society is developing in its sort of true sense. Now, The question, however, then is, if you are not interested in economic prosperity, then, or if you are not only interested in economic prosperity, then what else are you interested in? Okay? Here, Amartya Sen's idea is to move away from the aggregate numbers or figures that people should be looking at in order to determine, and move towards a more individual based approach in understanding development. What do I mean by moving away from aggregate and moving to individual? Well, in terms of economic growth, it's an aggregate measure of how the society is doing, right? We measure growth for a country, right, or a state in India, let's say. So it's a very aggregate feature, or even the GDP per capita, it's an aggregate number, aggregated across incomes of various people. The idea is to move away from this aggregate measure and to focus on certain features of society which can be identified at an individual level. So that's the first point, that we should move away from aggregate to the individual. But then what aspects of the individuals that we should be looking at? So should we be looking at individual incomes rather than income at the national level? Is that what he's saying? And the answer is no. Amartya Sen conceptualizes development as a sort of a broad-based, multidimensional concept. And the word or the jargon that he uses is capability. What here we refer as capacity to live full lives. So Amartya Sen's conceptualization of development is at an individual level, whether an individual is able to live the life to its fullest, okay, to realize his or her full potential. Now, what does that mean? We're going to unpack that in few slides from now, but think in terms of various aspects of life that society deems is very important for important to be attainable to be able to live a full life. So, for example, to be healthy and live a long life, right? So that's an attainable, measurable goal that we as society can think as something essential for somebody to have in order to live a full life. There might be other things, but certainly to have a healthy, long life is an important feature of living a full life. And therefore, that aspect of an individual can be termed as one particular dimension of development. Then what we want to understand is, if we think, for example, health, living a long and healthy lives is indeed an important dimension of living a full life, then we should collect data and information about to what extent individuals are able to achieve that specific goal. Okay. Therefore, you can think about underdevelopment, which is the sort of opposite concept of development, as a stage where society and the economic milieu is imposing restrictions on life, so that a lot of these goals have not been able to, individuals are not being able to achieve a lot of these goals. So basically, underdevelopment, you can think about underdevelopment as restrictions on living a full life, specifically restrictions on attaining each of these goals that we as society deem as essential to be attained in order to live a full life. Okay? And these kind of restrictions on living a full life, these kind of specific restrictions on, say, health or, say, education, etc., we can think of this as unfreedom, that individuals are not free to have a full and to have a healthy and long life. There are restrictions imposed by societal structures so that individuals are not able to, a vast majority of individuals say, are not able to attain that goal. So that would be thought of as an unfreedom on experienced by the individuals. Okay? So we are associating the concept of development with the concept of being free to live a full life. Therefore, underdevelopment are restrictions on this freedom, and hence can be thought of as unfreedoms of various kinds. Okay? So let me unpack this idea of unfreedom. Now, when I'm going to unpack the idea of unfreedom, always think in terms of whether or not income alone is going to unshackle me from this unfreedom. Okay? Is it the case that if I'm rich enough, I'm able to necessarily live a healthy and long life? Okay? So that's the kind of questions you should be thinking about when you are thinking about these kinds of various kinds of unfreedom that sort of go beyond the traditional notion of income and what it gives you. Okay? Because we want to expand the notion of development from the notion of economic prosperity. So when we are thinking of unfreedoms or freedoms, we should be sort of thinking whether uh, an individual having more income or wealth necessarily facilitates achieving that freedom. So the first kind of unfreedom, one can think of, or Amartya Sen sort of points out, is say unemployment. Now you can say, well, unemployment necessarily means less income, but let's wait. So here I'm drawing from Amartya Sen's book Development as Freedom, which I've referred in the syllabus. So this is sort of from the first chapter. So Amartya Sen says the presence of massive unemployment in Europe of about 10 to 12% in many of the major European countries, so that's a pretty large number, entails deprivations that are not well reflected in income distribution statistics. Why? Because European countries have very good social security measures that give unemployment insurance, very generous unemployment insurance to those who are unemployed. So therefore, if you just look at income, you may say that, well, it's the unemployed people are not really doing as worse relative to the employed guys as maybe in some other countries. So if you look at pure income distribution, you may sort of miss out the fact that 10 to 12% of working age population in Europe is unemployed, especially at the time when Amartya Sen is writing about these things in his late 1990s and early 2000s. Now, you may say that, well, if unemployment doesn't lead to a large fall in income, then why do we care? Well, we care because long-term unemployment can have a lot of other effects. So, for example, Amartya Sen points out it can negatively affect initiative and skill of individuals. So, if you stay unemployed, then your skill may erode and you may lack initiative to find productive employment. It may affect your self-confidence to be able to not just get employed later, but also self-confidence has effects on how you interact with other individuals in society, and it can have deep psychological and physical negative effects on deep psychological and physical. Moreover, if you a lot of social networks, peer group is profession based, right? So if you are employed, you sort of get connected to your peers through social networks that gets formed in your workplace. But if you remain unemployed, it may lead to exclusion from these social groups, which is very vital aspect of living a full life. Social connections not just matter for getting a better job later in your career, but it also matters in terms of the quality of life that you lead, right? So if you stay unemployed, it may have negative consequences in terms of isolation, social isolation. So therefore, you can think that even though the status of unemployment does not lead to a large fall in income, especially in European countries, it may still have certain kind of unfreedoms built into it which can sort of restrict people from living their full lives on various aspects. Okay, so that sort of is the first example. The second one is kind of important and pertinent. It is in the context of United States. So this is called despair, death of despair. So this is based on a very recent book that Case and Angus Deaton wrote, titled Deaths of Despair. So what they notice is that if they look at mortality rates of whites in United States, so these are the relatively privileged group, right? And if they look at sort of these middle-aged 50 to 55 or above 50, generally speaking, whites in the United States, their mortality has started increasing dramatically after the year 2000. So here is an image. You can see that it's kind of remains flat till 2000, and then it starts rising dramatically post 2000. While a lot of these other countries are either flat or are going down. And what they point out is that even though this group is relatively privileged compared to, say, African Americans in the US, because of globalization, loss of manufacturing jobs, of sort of stagnant wages, because unions are no longer a strong institution, they see a very bleak future. They don't see any prosperity happening going forward. They don't see their lives improving. They sort of don't see any hope because there are sort of a lot of jobs available to people like them and their peer groups. They see is kind of disappearing. Okay? And social structures are breaking down. They're not able to find partners in marriage market. So these kind of loss of hope over and above loss of income is leading to a lot of despair. And what the Case and Deaton report is that the increasing deaths of the whites is pretty much all explained by a certain category of deaths. So this is deaths due to drugs, alcohol, and suicide, which is what they report here. But even if you look at overall death rates, that sort of has been going up. But if you break it down by cause of death, you see that it's all driven by this category of drugs, alcohol, and suicide. So these kinds of manifestation of unfreedom tells you that this can happen even in relatively privileged groups. Even when their material well-being, if you look at sort of in terms of absolute standards, is much better than not just poor people in other countries, but also other disadvantaged groups in their own country. And even then you see people feeling despair and no hope. So it's important to point out that these numbers do not rise as rapidly for the African Americans, and in fact, the only reason that they rise to for the African Americans, we see some rise towards the end of the 2010s is because of sort of prevalence of certain kind of painkiller drugs, sort of oversupply of painkiller drugs. So it's kind of death due to overdosage. But for whites, it's specifically sort of there is demand is a specific and important aspect of increase in mortality rate. So you see despair can creep in large section of a society, even when they are materially not as worse of as their other members of their own country. The second big sort of subtopic within the unfreedom is discrimination, of course. Again, here the comparison, the context I'm going to talk about is United States, but now I'm not going to be comparing. I'm not going to be talking about disadvantages faced by whites, but by the African Americans. So in the graph you see, uh, um, so this is again from Amartya Sen's book Development as Freedom. He's plotting the mean survival rate at various ages. Okay, and it's a downward sloping line. Why? Because the older you are less likely to survive. So it's a downward sloping line, but the slopes are very different for the whites in US and the African Americans or the blacks in the US. And so there's a stark difference between them. And in fact, the blacks in the US are worse off relative to some of the well-performing states in India, such as Kerala, and also relative to China on average. So what you see is that due to systematic discrimination against the African Americans in US, institutionally, socially, politically, in all forms, some of which are getting manifested in the weeks, in sort of these past few weeks, that you see sort of large demonstrations by African Americans, sort of registering their displeasure about the way they are getting sort of treated by, say, the law enforcement agency. But this kind of discrimination is widespread for African Americans, which gets reflected in this mean surviving rates. So you can see societal, political, and economic discrimination as again a kind of unfreedom that is affecting a subgroup of population in the US. And similarly, we can think about caste discrimination in the context of India as a kind of unfreedom. And again, I sort of remind you to keep in mind that we are talking about the kind of unfreedom that is hard to overcome just by becoming rich. Okay. So what's the next topic? Again, another big topic within the list of unfreedoms that can exist even in developed societies, or even in spite of economic prosperity happening in any society, is of course gender disparity. So here, Amartya Sen separately has written about this important concept of missing women, and he invokes this idea in this book as well. What does he talk about? What does he mean when he says missing women? Well, he says that if you look at sort of a probability of a girl being born versus a boy being born, the probability is sort of slightly in favor of women. So if there were no discrimination in society, we'll have a little bit more girl child being born than boys. So if there were no discrimination post-birth, then in the population we should see a little bit higher than 50% of women than men. Okay, so we can look at sex ratios in the population, and get a sense of to what extent there is gender disparity, depending on to what extent it falls below 50% or it stays above 50%. So here is a graph that he puts out in the book, which sort of tells you the relative female to male sex ratios in the total population in a set of countries or regions. So on the very far left you have Europe, which has sort of one of the highest sex ratios in the world, and on the right you have Pakistan, which is one of the lowest sex ratios in this plot, right next to India. However, I would like you to focus on this group, the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe compare them to this, which is China. So China is economically much more prosperous than sub-Saharan Africa, but in terms of gender disparity, you see women facing a lot of unfreedom or restrictions on living their lives fully in China relative to that in sub-Saharan Africa. So you see that it's going beyond again economic prosperity. So there are aspects of development that economic prosperity cannot automatically overcome. So there needs to be specific focus, analysis, discussions, policy targeting, trying to free the society from these kinds of unfreedoms. Okay. And finally, you know, uh, environmental degradation is kind of one big kind of unfreedom. It is a societal level unfreedom, but it has manifestations or implications at an individual level. So, this is the image of a typical winter in Delhi for the past few years. So we live rather unhealthy lives, even though in terms of income, we have, in the city of Delhi, Delhi has seen a lot of economic prosperity, but at the same time has seen its sort of air quality plummet rather precipitously, and therefore our capacity to live full lives, especially those of the newborns in Delhi, is going to be greatly hampered by the air quality, even if they are born in relatively rich households. So again, you can think of environmental degradation affecting quality of life, which is sort of is a kind of unfreedom that economic prosperity cannot automatically overcome. So I have sort of given you a broad description of various kinds of unfreedoms that we see in society that Amartya Sen is saying we should focus on if we are interested in development. So that's point one. And the point two is economic prosperity alone will not ensure that these kinds of unfreedoms are removed. Okay? So we need specific analysis and policies targeting these unfreedoms. So that's sort of his broad point. And that should be our takeaway, that development is a multidimensional concept. It has various features. Economic prosperity certainly helps in removing some of the unfreedoms, at least to some extent, but definitely it's not an end in itself. It's an instrumental. It has instrumental value. Income has instrumental value, but we should not be intrinsically interested in increasing income. If you're interested in development, development requires us to focus on aspects of life that we intrinsically value, and I've mentioned some of the negatives of those aspects in the unfreedom list, and therefore we should sort of think about to what extent individuals are able to attain those goals that they intrinsically value. Okay? So that's sort of his broad framework of development, which is development as what he calls capabilities. So he defines capabilities are ends that individuals intrinsically value. So capability of living a long healthy life, capability of being educated or knowledgeable, capability of participating in community life without shame. So these are various kinds of goals that a lot of people value intrinsically, and if we are interested in development, we should think about this set of capabilities, which he refers to as capability set, and we should try to measure to what extent individuals in a society are able to attain each of these capabilities. Okay? So Sen says that we should have an irreducible or essential set of capabilities. You can have a long list of capabilities. To what extent the list is long depends on how collectively in society we decide what things are intrinsically valuable to live a full life. But there certainly can be a sort of an irreducible or essential list of capabilities that we agree that must be met in order to have any chance of living a full life. Therefore, this irreducible set of capabilities is what Amartya Sen refers to as the capability set. Okay. Now, each of the elements of this set he refers to as functionings. So this is just a terminology to keep in mind. So functionings are specific goals that you need to achieve in order to become free or become capable of on a certain dimension. And so these capability set consists of these sort of individual functionings. And as I said, the capability set is decided by the society in context and also could be contingent on time. What set of goals or values that we should have in terms of living a full life, that can sort of that can change as a society moves through history and prospers, etc. So, for example, today having access to internet is going to be essential to have a short and good education. Therefore, having access to internet might be an important functioning in the capabilities. And so the way to think about the process of development is to think about expansion of this set of capabilities for individuals in society. So maybe today, if you look at India, vast majorities of the population have very small amount of capabilities or capacities or functionings that they can achieve. And our goal as policymakers or as government or as society in general should be to expand this set of capability, and because that will facilitate individuals to live a fuller life. Okay, and because we are sort of going about expanding these capabilities as a policy goal, we can think about development as giving people the freedom to live a full life. Okay, so that's sort of Amartya Sen's broad thesis is to conceptualize development as freedom, to give people freedom to live a full life along many dimensions. Okay, and our job as researchers or analysts is to understand what those dimensions consist of and how we can make progress in terms of making these goals attainable to vast majorities of people in our society. Okay? So that sort of is the broad understanding of development as capabilities or as freedoms. Great. So now that we have talked about development sort of broadly, let me start focusing on this concept of poverty that lies at the heart of development economics. So, given the way Sen frames the very notion of development as this set of capabilities, you can think of poverty, which is sort of a lack of development and a manifestation of lack of development, of the phenomenon or incidence of poverty, as capability deprivation. Okay, so he's sort of going beyond the income definition of poverty. He says that income definition of poverty, or poverty seen through the lens of income or low income, is thinking about poverty through the instrumental value, attaching on income some intrinsic value while it should have instrumental value. So we should think of income as an instrument in allowing individuals to escape poverty and attain a greater set of capabilities. But we should not think of income, a higher income per se in itself as escape from poverty. So Sen's definition of poverty is lack of capabilities. So lack of list of things, lack of attainability of list of things that individuals value intrinsically. So if I am not able to attain this minimum irreducible core list of capabilities as an individual, then I am poor. Okay? So that's the idea. And then he sort of points out that the income poverty relationship one can understand to be a variable if one thinks of this sort of multidimensional view of poverty. Poverty as lack of freedom or lack of capabilities. Because the capacity with which income, a greater income, can be translated to escape from unfreedom of various kinds and attainability of various capabilities is very variable. So, for example, he points out that this income poverty relationship depends on various individual specific factors such as age or gender. So, remember our discussion previously about gender disparity. Especially say in China and India, so the capacity with which income is able to unshackle women to participate or to live a full life is context dependent. Okay? And therefore, so definitely the income poverty relationship is not same for men and women in India or in China. As well as various society specific factors such as geography, institutions, policy, community network, etc. So again, your ability to live a full life can be greater or lower, conditional on your income, if you have a better community network. Suppose if you have a lot of support from your community in terms of your distress, you can reach out to your friends and neighbors and get help. Or to what extent government is effectively implementing policies that help ameliorate some of these unfreedom. So, for example, to what extent there is public health available at free of cost to people who do not have a lot of income. Okay? So then the income poverty relationship is going to be dependent on effectiveness of delivery of health services by the government. So the idea is to then think about not income poverty but poverty as capability deprivation, and think about to what extent income may or may not ameliorate them, and to what extent then we have a role for the government and the community or the society in general to sort of step in and expand this set of capabilities for individuals. One point to mention, on which we'll talk about later a few slides down the line, is that relative income of an individual may have absolute capability deprivation. So what do I mean? I mean that even if my income is same between say now and tomorrow, but others have gone much richer, so my relative income relative to my rest of the society, if that has fallen, then it can hamper my relative deprivation. It can hamper my absolute deprivation of capabilities. I may not be able to say access education because suddenly school will become very expensive, right? Because if society becomes richer and I remain, my income remains, suddenly certain items which are essential for me to say attain a full life will suddenly become unaffordable. Okay, so my absolute deprivation, capability deprivation, may be caused by relative income, even though my absolute income remains. So that's sort of one point to keep in mind. This point is interesting. So Sen also points out that capabilities are sort of this list of things, and society may sometimes have to make trade-offs. Maybe society is not able to ensure that everybody, all members of the society are able to attain all the elements in that capability set. But depending on this sort of lack of freedom that individuals in a society has, a government or a society may be more invested in making certain restrictions or certain unfreedoms to be removed versus others. Okay? The society may be invested in certain aspects of capability much more than others. and which aspect that the society is sort of relatively more invested on can vary across society. So he gives this nice example of Western European countries versus United States. So as I already mentioned, unemployment rate has been very high in Western European countries for some time, certainly in the 1990s and early 2000s. And he says that it seems that we have already talked about unemployment imposing various kinds of unfreedoms well and beyond income, lack of income, but it seems that Western European countries are very tolerant of high unemployment. Okay? They don't consider those kinds of deprivations to be super important, as opposed to in the United States. So he says that these kinds of high unemployment rate of 10 to 12% in the US would be a dynamite. The parties in power would lose elections if the unemployment rate reaches 10 to 12% and stays there for significant amount of time. It will lead to social upheaval, right? So United States as a society seems to be really invested in ensuring that everybody is gainfully employed, and whatever sort of the consequent capabilities that gets facilitated by that. On the other hand, United States seems to be really tolerant of lack of access to basic healthcare. So in the United States there is no public health, there is no sort of government-provided healthcare. There are all private. It's all sort of operated in a private market, and there are health insurance available. However, a significant part of the population do not have insurance and therefore do not have access to basic health. And the United States, even though they are sort of, it becomes a political issue, the situation has remained the same for a very long time. Okay, so it seems that United States as a country seems to be fine with having a policy paralysis and a lot of people not having access to healthcare as a consequence of that. On the other hand, this is unimaginable in Western Europe. So in Western Europe, they have robust public health systems which give free access to basic healthcare to all individuals in society, and therefore it seems that Western European countries are really invested in healthcare as sort of facilitating certain capabilities. So the sort of relative emphasis on various different things by different societies is interesting because it tells us about what societies care about more versus others in terms of trading off capabilities within this sector. Further narrowing down our focus. So first, as I have already discussed, poverty is a sort of a multidimensional concept, conceptualized as a capability deprivation, and therefore various aspects of society affects poverty well and beyond that individual's income. And we will have opportunity later in the course to talk about modern research that attempts to unpack these relationships between, say, access to community network and escaping poverty. Okay, or removing or reducing gender disparity and escaping poverty. Okay, so we will talk about those sort of aspects of multidimensional aspects of poverty. But for now, let's concern ourselves with material poverty or income poverty. As I've already mentioned, income, you can think of income having instrumental value in reducing or in facilitating individuals to attain some of the capabilities. So lack of income or income-based poverty can have implications in terms of capability deprivation along various lines. So if you do not have a lot of income, you may not be able to eat enough food, which will have effect on your health. So living a healthy long life, that capability will get affected. You will not be able to gainfully employed, so your ability to be gainfully employed will get affected. You may not be able to pay for higher education, so your capacity or capability to get educated and knowledgeable will get affected. So income definitely has implications for capability deprivation and hence consequently on poverty. So the idea is to then think about uh, what is the income equivalent of this lack of capabilities that 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 individuals are facing. So if you want to think about poverty as lack of capabilities, then how can you translate this lack of capabilities in terms of income? Okay? So in other words, what amount of income does an individual need in order to attain some of these capabilities? Of course, I've already discussed that not everything is attainable. So therefore, here the goal is rather limited. The goal is to ensure attainability of certain capabilities, a subset of that list, which can be attained by having more income. And the one thing that, for example, uh, 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 researchers have specifically focused on is nutrition. So nutrition is something which you can meet in terms of purchasing food through having more income, and therefore uh, uh, one aspect of poverty will be malnutrition or lack of nutrition, and one can compute the income required to sort of escape that kind of unfreedom. Here again, it's important to talk about the concept of absolute and relative poverty. I have already alluded to it when I was talking about capabilities, the fact that relative income can have absolute capability deprivation. So here again, we have to talk about income poverty specifically, but even in the income poverty, so poverty measured in terms of income, can also have absolute and relative concepts associated with it. So what is absolute poverty? So absolute poverty is the income equivalent of the list of essential set of capabilities that you need to attain in order to live any healthy life. So again, so think in terms of nutrition. So suppose if you have sort of minimum nutrition standards that you need to meet in order to remain healthy or not fall sick, then you need to find out what is the minimum income you need in order to attain that nutrition level, and that could be one measure of absolute poverty. So if your income is below that minimum level, then you are absolutely poor, okay? Poor in the absolute sense. However, even if your income is above the absolute level, which helps you attain the nutritional standards, but yet if your income is relatively much lower relative to say the rest of the country, then it might make it unaffordable for you to attain some of the other capabilities. Okay, so in that sense, you could be relatively poor even if you are not poor in the absolute sense. Okay, now when I'm talking about relative, so the question arises relative to whom, um, and a sort of a common benchmark is the sort of the national average income, let's say, is the usual benchmark, but that need not necessarily be the case. You can think of maybe individuals' capacity to access some of the other essential goods depend on the neighborhood that they live in. So maybe their neighbors are the relevant comparison group relative to whom my income really matters. So if my neighborhood becomes really rich, then all the shops around my neighborhood will increase their prices, and therefore certain things which were attainable to me before will suddenly become unattainable. Okay? So the comparison group certainly is an important feature that needs analysis in order to determine whether you're poor in a relative sense. Now, I want to talk more about income poverty and its measurement. But before I go to the measurement, it's sort of, I thought it would be important to talk about uh, uh, the um, uh, uh, the historical evolution of the notion of poverty. how an attitude, societal attitude towards poverty. So the reason why I thought I think it's important to discuss this sort of history of this concept of poverty, is because today we take it for granted that it's the job of the government to reduce poverty. We think that we should not, as a society, have poverty, high incidence of poverty. But this was not always the case. The attitude towards poverty was very different, say in the 16th and 17th century, compared to what it is today. And that evolution may be an important lesson that we can keep in mind while thinking about poverty and its attitude in society. So let me talk about that.